The first light of dawn spills over a quiet street in Manistee, Michigan. Three unmarked police cruisers glide to a stop. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a low hum in the chilly morning air. Officers step out and move with quiet precision toward a modest brick house. It's the kind of place neighbors have walked past 1,000 times, barely noticing. Inside lives a man everyone knows, a friendly face at church, a voice at town meetings, a regular in the bleachers at Friday night football games. A man people trusted. But on this November morning in 2009, that trust is about to crumble because the DNA results just came back, and after 30 long years of silence, the evidence has finally found its voice. Our story starts 3 decades earlier, November 1979, a cold night when 20-year-old Sarah Renard walked out of her shift at the local diner and vanished into the Michigan darkness. Her disappearance became the town's most haunting mystery. The case froze over, the trail went cold, but her family never stopped searching for the truth. What no one could have imagined was that the person responsible had been there all along, smiling in their faces, shaking hands, standing at candlelight vigils, even looking Sarah's mother straight in the eye. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you love true stories that dig deep into small-town secrets, hit that subscribe button. Because this one, it's going to leave you speechless. Let's rewind to where it all began. Manistee, Michigan. Population, just over 3,500 souls. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Nestled in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, along the northern edge of Lake Michigan, Manistee is the kind of place most people stumble upon by accident. It's the town you pass through on your way somewhere else. Blink twice, and you've missed Main Street entirely. But in 1979, for the folks who called it home, Manistee wasn't just a dot on the map. It was everything. This was small-town America at its purest, the kind of place that still looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Front doors stayed unlocked. Your neighbor wasn't just the person next door. They were family. They'd shovel your driveway after a blizzard, bring a casserole when someone passed, and never forget your kid's birthday. The town revolved around a few cornerstones: the lumber mills, the paper plant, a handful of mom-and-pop diners, and of course, high school football under the Friday night lights. Sundays were reserved for church. Not going wasn't really an option. It's where you caught up on gossip, talked business, and quietly took note of who was dating who. Main Street had everything you needed, and nothing you didn't. There was Lewis Hardware, Myers Pharmacy, where old Mr. Myers still filled prescriptions by hand and knew every customer's aches and pains by name. The Copper Kettle Diner, with its red vinyl booths and coffee strong enough to peel paint. And the town's single movie theater, which showed films about 3 months after they left the big cities. The late 70s were a strange time in America. The country was still recovering from Vietnam and Watergate. Gas prices were climbing, inflation was biting, and faith in government felt shaky. But in Manistee, life carried on. Folks kept their heads down, worked hard, and looked out for each other. Up in the Upper Peninsula, the economy lived and died by logging, fishing, and a bit of summer tourism. Mostly folks from downstate coming up to rough it in cabins for a week before heading back to city life. Then came winter. And when winter hit the UP, it didn't mess around. Temperatures sank below zero. Snow piled up higher than a man's shoulders. The lake froze solid enough to drive a pickup truck across. By November of 1979, everyone was gearing up for another long, hard season. Deer hunting was in full swing. It might as well have been a national holiday up there. The high school football team had wrapped up its season. Thanksgiving was around the corner, and folks were checking furnaces, swapping tires, and stocking up on canned goods. Life moved slower then. There were no cell phones, no internet. If you wanted to talk to someone, you called their landline or you showed up at their door. Back then, news didn't travel by push notifications or social media. It spread the old-fashioned way, through small talk at the grocery store, while getting your hair done at the beauty salon, or over a steaming cup of coffee at the diner. If you wanted to know what was going on beyond your own front yard, you picked up the Manistee Pioneer Tribune, the weekly paper that landed in mailboxes every Thursday. It was the community's lifeline. Birth announcements, local gossip, city council updates, all packed neatly between ads for tire shops and hardware sales. Entertainment was simple. You had maybe 3 TV channels, 4 if your antenna was angled just right. The radio played local news in the mornings and classic rock all day long. And if you were lucky enough to have an 8-track player, you were king of the carpool. Weekends were for cruising down Main Street, windows rolled down, the Eagles or Leonard Skynyrd blaring through speakers that crackled more than they sang. Teenagers parked at the old A&W root beer stand or killed time at the bowling alley, sipping cherry cokes and talking about nothing in particular. It was a tight-knit community, so tight it could feel suffocating if you didn't quite fit in. Everybody knew your business. If your dad drank too much, people whispered. If your sister got pregnant before marriage, they whispered louder. Your reputation was your currency, and gossip was the town's unofficial pastime. But there was comfort in that closeness too, a sense of safety, or at least what felt like safety. Crime, hardly ever. Maybe a bar fight, a kid caught shoplifting, or someone driving home after one too many beers. But murder? That was the stuff of city headlines. Detroit, Chicago, downstate where things had, as people like to say, gone to hell. Not here. Not in Monaste. Parents didn't think twice about their daughters walking home after dark. Why would they? Everyone knew everyone. The local police force, just 5 officers strong, mostly handled noise complaints, wandering dogs, and the occasional broken window. People looked out for each other because that's just how life worked. That's how it had always worked. And that's exactly why what happened to Sarah Renard hit so deep. Because in a place where trust was a given, evil managed to blend in perfectly, hiding right there, in plain sight. Sarah Marie Renard was just 20 years old when her life was taken. 20. That in-between age, old enough to dream big, young enough to still believe anything was possible. She had her mother's dark hair, her father's stubborn streak, and a smile that could melt away any argument. About 5'6", with an easy laugh that filled a room and a kindness that seemed limitless. She was the kind of person who remembered your name after meeting you once, who'd stop to help an elderly neighbor with groceries, who always had a stick of gum to share. Sarah grew up right there in Monaste. Her father, Robert Renard, worked at the paper mill. 30 years on the floor, no complaints, just the kind of hard-working backbone small towns are built on. Her mother, Diane, was a substitute teacher at the elementary school and sang in the church choir every Sunday without fail. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Pine Street, white siding, green shutters, and a little porch where they'd sit on summer evenings, watching the world go by. Sarah had a younger brother, Michael, 17 at the time, who absolutely adored her. The two were inseparable, sharing inside jokes, teasing each other, but always sticking together when it came to facing their parents' old-fashioned rules. They dreamed of one day leaving the UP, maybe heading south, maybe out west, to see what the rest of the world looked like beyond the endless pines and frozen lakes. Sarah had graduated from Monaste High just 2 years earlier. She wasn't the top of her class, but she was smart, curious, and determined. Teachers remembered her as the kind of student who might struggle with a subject but never gave up. She played volleyball, sang in the school musical, and even earned a yearbook title, most likely to brighten your day. After graduation, though, like so many kids from small towns, her choices were limited. College was out of reach, too expensive, too confusing. Student loans were something her family had only heard about, not something they understood. So Sarah did what most did. She stayed. She worked. She saved what she could, hoping that someday she'd figure out the next step. She'd been waitressing at Maggie's Diner on Main Street for about 1.5 years. It wasn't glamorous work. Minimum wage plus tips. And tips in a town like Monaste didn't exactly make you rich. But she liked the people. She liked the rhythm of it, the smell of coffee, the sound of the bell over the door, the regulars who came in like clockwork. And maybe deep down, she liked being part of something steady. Sarah had a real knack for her job at Maggie's Diner. She knew every regular's order by heart. Black coffee for Mr. Jensen, no onions for the Mitchells, extra syrup for little Tommy Jr. She could charm a grumpy breakfast crowd just as easily as she could handle a group of rowdy teenagers after a football game. Always smiling, always steady. Her shifts often ran late. She'd work the dinner rush, then stay through the quiet hours when only truckers and night owls wandered in before closing at 11. But she didn't mind. The work gave her purpose, kept her busy, and surrounded her with people. And Maggie, the diner's owner, treated her staff like family, firm when she needed to be, but always fair. Still, Sarah dreamed bigger than coffee refills and greasy plates. She wanted to become a nurse. It wasn't just a passing idea, it was a calling. She'd been saving every spare dollar, researching nursing programs at community colleges downstate, talking about it with anyone who'd listen. She'd say things like, "I've always been the one my friends come to when they get hurt," or "I just want to do something that matters." You could tell she meant it. She could already picture herself in scrubs, making a real difference in people's lives. Sarah was also seeing Tommy Holstead, a mechanic at the Ford dealership. They'd been on and off since high school. Not exactly high drama, but steady enough that folks around town saw them as a couple. Tommy was a good man. Rough around the edges, sure, but honest, hard-working, and deeply protective of Sarah. They'd talk sometimes about the future. Maybe getting married, maybe buying a little house, maybe staying in Monasta, or maybe not. But if there was one thing Sarah loved more than anything, it was her friends. She had a close-knit circle of girls she'd known since kindergarten. The kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and share a lifetime of inside jokes. On weekends, they'd drive up to Escanaba for shopping trips, or sit around someone's kitchen table with a bottle of cheap wine, laughing until their sides hurt. Sarah was the heart of that group, the one who gave the best advice, who never broke a confidence, who always showed up when you needed her. The town adored her, not because she was flashy or extraordinary, but because she was genuine. She volunteered at the church's holiday food drive. She babysat for neighbors without being asked. She even came back to help decorate for the high school homecoming dance, long after she'd graduated. Sarah Renard was the kind of person who made a small town feel smaller in all the right ways. She was the thread that stitched the community together, the smile you counted on, the face you were glad to see. And then on a cold November night in 1979, that thread was torn away. November 14th, 1979, a Wednesday. It started just like any other day. Sarah woke up around 9, had breakfast with her mom, toast, coffee, and the usual chatter about nothing important. Her shift at Maggie's didn't start until 3, so she spent the morning doing laundry, calling her friend Jennifer to plan a weekend shopping trip to Escanaba, and flipping through a nursing school brochure she'd gotten in the mail. Completely normal, utterly unremarkable. Outside, the weather was classic Upper Peninsula November. Gray skies, temperatures hovering in the low 30s, and that damp cold that finds its way straight into your bones. No snow yet, but you could feel it coming. Sarah showed up to Maggie's diner at 2:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, just like always. She tied on her apron, poured herself a cup of coffee, and got the place ready for the dinner crowd. Wednesdays were usually steady but calm. Locals stopping in for meatloaf and mashed potatoes, maybe a slice of pie for dessert. Her coworker that night was Linda Martinez, another waitress who'd been with Maggie for years. The two had a good rhythm, moving around each other with the kind of ease that comes from shared experience. No need to talk about who took which tables. They just knew. Later, Linda would tell police that Sarah seemed completely normal that night, happy even. She talked about Tommy, about how they were planning to drive up to Marquette that weekend to catch a movie at the nicer theater up there. She was in a great mood, Linda remembered, joking around, singing along to the radio in the kitchen, just being Sarah. The dinner rush hit around 6. Factory workers still wearing their uniforms came in for hearty meals. Families shuffled in with kids half asleep in their seats. Elderly couples arrived like clockwork, ordering the same dinners they'd had every Wednesday for years. Just another night in Monasta. At least that's how it seemed. Sarah moved through her section like a pro that night, chatting easily with the regulars, handling the occasional grumpy customer with that same calm charm everyone knew her for. By around 8:30 p.m., things had started to quiet down. A few late-night coffee drinkers lingered at the counter, and a handful of teenagers squeezed into a corner booth, nursing sodas and splitting one sad little basket of fries, trying to stretch $2 into an entire evening. One of those teens, a local high school junior named Danny Schultz, would later remember Sarah stopping by their table around 9. She topped off their water glasses and teased them when the Bee Gees came on the jukebox, told them their taste in music was hopeless. She seemed totally fine, Danny told investigators later. Laughing, joking, just normal. By 9:30, the diner was practically empty. Maggie came out from the kitchen and told Sarah and her coworker, Linda, they could start on closing duties early. Sarah wiped down tables, refilled the salt and pepper shakers, rolled silverware into neat napkin bundles for the next day. She was scheduled to work until 10:30, but it was a slow night. So when Maggie told them they could clock out early, neither woman argued. At 10 o'clock sharp, Sarah punched her card, grabbed her navy blue parka with the fake fur hood, and slung her favorite brown leather purse, her last birthday gift, over her shoulder. She smiled, said goodnight to Linda, waved to Maggie and pushed open the front door. The little bell above it jingled softly. It was exactly 10:07 p.m. The walk home was one she'd made hundreds of times before. Less than a mile. Straight down Main Street for 4 blocks, then a right turn onto Maple Avenue, 3 more blocks to Pine Street. Her family's house sat 6th from the corner. The streetlights were glowing. Main Street still had a bit of life left in it. A couple cars passed through, headlights bouncing off frosted shop windows. The corner bar was still open, its neon Pabst Blue Ribbon sign buzzing faintly in the cold air. A middle-aged couple walked their dog down the sidewalk. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah Renard came around 10:15 p.m. when George Peterson, a retired postal worker, was locking up his hardware store. He looked up and saw Sarah walking past on the opposite sidewalk. She waved, he waved back. Later, George would replay that moment again and again, every night for years. I should have offered her a ride, he told police, voice cracking. I should have walked with her. I should have done something. But in that moment, there was nothing strange about what he saw. Just a young woman walking home. After that, nothing. Sarah never made it to Maple Avenue. She never made the turn. She simply vanished, swallowed up by the November night. At home, Diane Renard wasn't worried at first. 10:30 came and went. Sarah's shifts sometimes ran a little late if cleanup took longer than expected. But when the clock hit 11, Diane felt the first flicker of unease. By 11:15, she picked up the phone and called Maggie's diner. Maggie answered, confused. Sarah had left over an hour ago. Both girls had clocked out right at 10. That's when worry turned sharp and real. Diane woke her husband, Robert. He tried to stay calm, tried to reason it through. Maybe she stopped at a friend's house, and he said, maybe she ran into Tommy. Maybe, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. Robert called Tommy's house. It was Tommy's mother who answered, groggy and irritated at the late call. No, he's been home since 9, she said. He's asleep. Why? What's going on? When Robert hung up, the fear had already taken root. He got dressed, grabbed his flashlight, and drove the route Sarah would have walked. Slowly, scanning both sides of the street. Nothing. He passed the diner, dark and locked up tight. He circled through downtown. Still nothing. Back home, Diane was on the phone, calling Sarah's friends one by one. Jennifer hadn't heard from her since that morning. Kathy hadn't seen her all day. No one knew anything. By midnight, the fear had fully bloomed. The Renards knew something was very wrong. At 12:23 a.m., Robert picked up the phone and called the Monaste Police Department. His voice was shaking. My daughter is missing. And somewhere out there, in the freezing dark, Sarah Renard's life was slipping away. In a town of just 3,500 people, a missing girl wasn't just news. It was personal. Everyone knew her. Everyone knew her family. The problem was the Monaste Police Department wasn't built for something like this. Their biggest cases usually involve bar fights or stolen bicycles. Missing persons? That was big city stuff. They had no playbook, no experience, no idea that this was only the beginning. By the time the sun rose over Monaste on that cold November morning, the entire town was awake and terrified. Sure, once in a while an elderly resident might wander off or a teenager might take off for a few days after a fight with their parents. But this was different. Sarah Renard wasn't the type to disappear. Officer Dale Hutchkins was the one who took Robert Renard's late-night call. He tried to stay professional, running through the usual checklist. Have you checked with her friends? Was there any kind of argument at home? Any chance she left on her own? Robert's answers came fast and firm. Number, absolutely not. Sarah hadn't argued with anyone. She wasn't in trouble. She had no reason to leave. Something's wrong, he said. This isn't like her. At first, Hutchkins did what he always did in missing person cases. Wait and see. Most folks turned up after a few hours, embarrassed, maybe laughing it off as a misunderstanding. But by dawn on November 15th, Sarah was still gone. And that's when everything changed. Police Chief Martin Kowalski, a lifelong Manistee resident with 3 decades on the force, knew this was serious. He called every available officer, all 5 of them, and reached out to the Michigan State Police for backup. Then he did something small-town chiefs know best. He asked the community to help. By 7 a.m., word was everywhere. The phone tree at First Lutheran Church was buzzing. The local radio station cut into its morning show with urgent updates. Within hours, the quiet town of 3,500 people had turned into a small army on a mission. Maggie, the diner owner, locked her front door and turned her business into a command center. Coffee was free. Sandwiches were piled high. Locals streamed in with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and maps. By mid-morning, over 200 volunteers had shown up. Loggers, factory workers, teachers, retirees, even teenagers who ditched school to help. They split into search teams. Some combed the thick woods outside town. Others walked every street, every alley, peering behind trash bins and into old sheds. A few brave souls took boats along the icy Lake Michigan shoreline, though the cold wind bit through their coats like knives. Robert was among them, exhausted but determined, flashlight in hand. His wife Diane stayed by the phone, refusing to leave the house, just in case Sarah called. Their son Michael, only 17, joined the search too, shouting his sister's name into the gray morning until his voice cracked and faded. It wasn't just the Renards who searched. The whole town did. The hardware store shut its doors. The pharmacy too. Even the grocery store put up a handwritten sign, "Closed," helping search for Sarah. The high school canceled classes so students and teachers could join the effort. Flyers appeared everywhere, taped to storefront windows, pinned to bulletin boards, stapled to telephone poles. They all bore the same image: Sarah's bright smile, her dark hair softly curled, and the words, "Missing, Sarah Marie Renard, age 20. Last seen November 14th, 10:15 p.m., Main Street." Meanwhile, the police worked every possible angle. They interviewed Sarah's co-workers. Linda Martinez repeated every detail she could remember from that evening shift. How Sarah had been cheerful, how nothing seemed out of place. Maggie confirmed the same. Sarah left at 10:07 p.m., happy, laughing, saying goodnight. Then came George Peterson, the retired postal worker who'd last seen her alive. He told them everything: where he'd been standing, how she'd waved, how normal it all looked. He was cleared quickly. His alibi was solid, and no one had a bad word to say about him. Next, the police questioned Sarah's boyfriend, Tommy Holstead. It was routine, but still hard. He looked wrecked, eyes red, hands shaking. He answered every question, and his alibi checked out. He'd been home with his parents all night. Neighbors even confirmed his truck hadn't moved. Officers canvassed Main Street, knocking on every door. Most folks had been inside that night, tucked in, watching TV, or already asleep. No one heard anything strange. No screams, no struggle, nothing. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished. And if you're feeling that chill crawl up your spine right now, you're not alone. This case is about to twist in ways no one in Manistee could have imagined. Before we go on, take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are right now? Because this story, it's only just beginning. The search for Sarah Renard stretched into its second day, and with it, the sense of hope began to thin like morning fog. Volunteers worked tirelessly, combing through the thick Upper Peninsula woods in careful grid patterns. They checked every rundown barn, every forgotten hunting shack, every shadowy spot where someone could hide or be hidden. Divers were brought in to search the harbor and nearby waterways, though the frigid water made it dangerous, grueling work. Still, they searched. And yet nothing. No purse, no coat, no shoe, not even a footprint out of place. It was as though Sarah had simply vanished. The Michigan State Police brought in tracking dogs. They started at Maggie's Diner, where Sarah had clocked out that night, and followed her scent down Main Street, right to the spot where George Peterson had seen her wave. Then abruptly the trail ended. Just stopped. As if she'd been lifted right off the earth, or more likely, forced into a vehicle. That chilling possibility hit everyone like a gut punch. This wasn't a case of a young woman lost or injured. This was something darker. By the end of the second day, the energy in town had changed. The chatter grew quieter. Faces looked heavier. That bright, desperate hope that she'd walk through the door any moment, embarrassed but alive, was fading fast. Sarah's mother, Diane, gave a heart-wrenching interview to the local paper, her eyes red and tired. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking, "if you know anything, anything at all, please help us bring our daughter home." Her words broke through the static of small-town life, like a prayer. But even with hundreds searching, Sarah was still gone. And somewhere out there, someone knew why. By the third day, the case shifted from a search and rescue to a criminal investigation. Chief Martin Kowalski knew time was slipping away. He called the Michigan State Police again, this time for serious help. They sent Detective Sergeant Frank Holloway, a veteran investigator from the Marquette Post. He arrived in Manassas on November 17th, just as the gray skies began to spit snow. Holloway was in his mid-40s, sharp-eyed, and all business. He had a reputation for being methodical, relentless, the kind of man who didn't let go once he sank his teeth into a case. He'd seen his share of ugliness working homicides downstate before transferring north, and he brought that big city experience to a small town that had never faced something like this. His first move? Build a precise timeline. Who'd seen Sarah? When? And who might have had reason or opportunity to hurt her? As always, he started with the most obvious suspect, the boyfriend. Tommy Holstead had already been interviewed once, but Holloway wanted another go, with tougher questions. Where exactly had he been that night? Could anyone besides his parents verify that? Had there been an argument? Jealousy? Another man? Tommy stayed calm but weary. He stuck to his story. He'd been home. His parents confirmed it. His truck hadn't moved. Even neighbors said it was parked in the driveway all night. He'd gone to bed around 9:30, completely unaware that anything was wrong until Robert Renard called the next morning. Holloway pressed harder, looking for cracks. He ordered a polygraph test. Tommy passed. Still, Holloway wasn't ready to cross him off the list. He'd seen enough cases to know. Boyfriends lie, parents protect, appearances deceive. From there, he widened the circle. Every man who worked at Maggie's Diner was questioned. The cook, Raymond Ellis, a quiet guy in his 30s, had left at 9:30 p.m. sharp. His wife confirmed he came straight home. Nothing suspicious. The dishwasher, 19-year-old Kevin Porter, clocked out at 10:15, after Sarah had already gone. He'd gone to a friend's house to play cards and smoke weed. 3 friends backed him up. Alibi solid. Investigators even looked into Sarah's ex-boyfriends. There was one from high school, Marcus Tillman. They'd broken up years ago. No drama, no bad blood. Marcus was now engaged and had been visiting family in Wisconsin that entire week. Verified. Then Holloway and his team turned to Sarah's closest friends. They were searching not for suspects, but for stories. Tiny moments or names that might hint at someone who'd made her uncomfortable. Someone who'd followed her. Someone who didn't belong. Because by this point, everyone knew one thing for sure. Whoever had taken Sarah Renard was still out there. Detective Holloway and his team kept digging, determined not to let the trail go cold. They interviewed everyone they could, friends, co-workers, customers, hoping anyone might remember something that didn't seem important at the time. They started hearing whispers. Jennifer, Sarah's best friend, recalled something odd from a few weeks before the disappearance. A truck driver had left Sarah a creepy note with his phone number scrawled across it. Sarah had laughed it off and tossed it in the trash. She hadn't seemed scared, just mildly annoyed. Jennifer couldn't remember the guy's name, or even what he looked like. It was a passing story at the time, but now every little detail mattered. Investigators tried to track down that mysterious trucker. They called trucking companies, checked delivery logs, even interviewed regular drivers who stopped at Maggie's diner. Nothing. It was a dead end. The deeper Holloway dug, the more uncomfortable things got around town. Monaste was small, only about 3,500 people, and suddenly it felt like everyone was under a microscope. Ordinary folks who'd never seen the inside of a police station were being questioned. Where were you that night? Can anyone verify that? What kind of car do you drive? Suspicion started to spread like frost over the community. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Conversations grew hushed. Rumors ran wild. One name that kept surfacing was Jerry Voss, a reclusive man in his 30s who lived out on the edge of town. People called him odd, though no one could say exactly why. He mostly kept to himself, didn't go to church, didn't hang out at the bar, and in a place like Monaste, that alone could make you stand out. Police brought him in for questioning. He said he'd been home that night, alone. No alibi, but also no real evidence against him. No car registered in his name, no violent record, no connection to Sarah. Just a quiet loner who suddenly found the whole town looking at him sideways. Detectives followed every other lead too. Maybe it was a stranger passing through, a drifter, a hitchhiker. It was November, not prime traveling season in the Upper Peninsula, but still possible. Someone reported seeing a beat-up van with out-of-state plates near Main Street that week. Police tracked it down. It belonged to a contractor doing renovation work 2 blocks over. Cleared. Another person mentioned a man asking for directions at the gas station the day Sarah disappeared. Investigators found him. He turned out to be a traveling salesman on his way to Escanaba. His story checked out. Cleared. Through it all, Holloway remained steady, meticulous, methodical, and above all, relentless. He built a detailed timeline of Sarah's last movements, down to the minute. He listed every car and truck seen near Main Street between 10 and 11 p.m. He interviewed every bar patron, every gas station customer, every night owl who might have been outside that night. But it was 1979. Investigations were a different world back then. No DNA testing, no security cameras, no cell phone data to ping locations, no digital trails. Forensics meant fingerprints, blood type, and fiber analysis. And even those required something to test. Sarah's purse was never found. Her coat was never found. There was no known crime scene. Just absence. The dogs had lost her scent on Main Street, right where the sidewalks ended. That pointed to a vehicle. But whose? Dozens of cars passed through town every night. Without a witness, it was like trying to find a single snowflake in a blizzard. Police collected fingerprints from the diner, from every lamppost, bench, and door Sarah might have touched. They got hundreds of prints, almost all from locals. Without a suspect to compare them to, they were just smudges on paper. They even collected hair and fiber samples from Sarah's bedroom, hoping that if they ever did find a suspect or a body, they'd have something, anything to match. But everyone knew it was a long shot. Frustration grew. Holloway was working 18-hour days, chasing down every tip, no matter how small. Chief Kowalski and his officers did the same. The town wanted answers, and they wanted them yesterday. But as the calendar flipped from November to December, the case was losing momentum. Volunteers had to go back to work. Search parties shrank. Flyers began to curl on the edges, weathered by wind and time. The energy that had fueled those first frantic days was fading. And then, on December 3rd, 1979, 19 long days after Sarah disappeared, a hunter stumbled upon something deep in the woods, something that would shatter the last fragile threads of hope, because what he found turned a missing persons case into a murder. December 3rd, 1979, a cold Monday morning in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Carl Bergman, an experienced hunter, set out early with his German Shepherd, Max, hoping to track a big buck through the thick woods northeast of Monaste, near an area locals called Thornton Creek. It was the kind of rugged wilderness where the trees pressed close, and the silence was so deep you could hear your own heartbeat. Hardly anyone ventured out there except hunters and loggers. Carl had been following tracks for an hour when Max suddenly froze. His ears pricked, his body stiffened, and then he bolted, barking wildly toward a dense patch of brush by a fallen oak. "Max! Heel!" Carl shouted, but the dog ignored him, barking frantically like something was terribly wrong. When Carl pushed through the undergrowth to see what had his dog so upset, he spotted it, a small flash of navy blue fabric beneath a blanket of leaves. His stomach dropped. The color, the fur-lined hood, it matched what he'd seen on every missing person poster for weeks. It was Sarah Renard's parka. Carl froze, his breath visible in the cold air. He didn't touch a thing. Backing away, trembling, he called Max to heel and made a beeline for his truck. The drive back to the Monastic Police Department felt like it took hours, even though it was barely 20 minutes. Max barked the whole way, as if he could sense the weight of what they'd found. Within half an hour, Thornton Creek was swarming with law enforcement. Detective Holloway, Chief Kowalski, State Police, the county medical examiner. They sealed off the site with yellow tape and began the grim task of documenting everything. Sarah's body was discovered about 15 feet off a logging road, hidden beneath branches and forest debris. She was still wearing her diner uniform beneath her parka. Her brown leather purse was nearby, its contents scattered. Wallet, keys, lipstick, coins. At the scene, the medical examiner performed an initial assessment before transporting her to Marquette for a full autopsy. The preliminary finding was devastating: manual strangulation. Sarah had been killed with someone's bare hands. The bruising pattern told the story. Pressure marks on her neck, signs of a violent struggle. Her hands and forearms bore scratches and bruises. She'd fought back fiercely. There was no evidence of sexual assault, which surprised investigators at first, but it made the crime even more puzzling. Whoever killed her hadn't done it for that reason. The medical examiner estimated she'd been killed the same night she vanished, sometime between 10:30 p.m. and midnight on November 14. All that time, the townspeople had hoped she was still alive, maybe taken somewhere, maybe just missing. But Sarah had been gone since that first night. The evidence at the scene was scarce but potentially vital. Tire tracks, half erased by weather, were cast and photographed. Investigators found dark blue cotton fibers on Sarah's clothing, fibers that didn't belong to her uniform. Maybe from a work shirt, maybe a jacket. A single boot print was discovered in the mud near her body. Size 11, common tread, not much to go on. Fingerprints lifted from her purse were incomplete, smudged, impossible to match without a suspect. Then there was the most chilling clue of all: skin and tissue trapped beneath Sarah's fingernails. She'd scratched her killer, fought hard enough to leave a piece of him behind. In 1979, that kind of evidence couldn't reveal much. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. All they could determine was blood type. Still, Detective Holloway made sure it was preserved. Every sample, every fiber, every photograph, carefully cataloged, sealed, and stored, just in case the day ever came when science could tell them more. That evidence would sit quietly in storage for 3 decades before it finally gave Sarah a voice again. The discovery shattered what little hope the town had left. The missing person posters that once carried the words, "Have you seen her?" were now reminders of a nightmare no one could wake from. Sarah Renard wasn't missing anymore. She was gone, murdered and left alone in the cold woods, not far from the home that had been searching for her. The people of Monastic went silent that winter. The laughter that once filled Maggie's diner disappeared. Parents stopped letting their daughters walk alone. And Detective Holloway, who'd promised Sarah's mother he'd find her, made a new promise that day. He wouldn't rest until he found the person who took her life. The news of Sarah's discovery hit Monastic like a thunderclap. The town that had spent weeks hoping, praying, and searching now had to face a reality too awful to imagine. Sarah wasn't coming home. When police knocked on the Renards' door, Diane collapsed before they even spoke. Robert had to be sedated. Their son Michael locked himself in his room and refused to come out for 2 days. The Renard home, once filled with laughter and the sound of music from Sarah's record player, was now silent, except for the sound of grief. Monastic itself seemed to stop breathing. Businesses closed, not for a search this time, but in mourning. The high school held a special assembly. Counselors came in from Escanaba to help students process what had happened. Teachers who had taught Sarah since she was a child wept openly in the hallways. At church that Sunday, pews were packed shoulder to shoulder. People came not just for comfort, but because they didn't know where else to go with their pain. The unspoken fear hung heavy in the air. If this could happen to Sarah, the kindest, most genuine girl in town, it could happen to anyone. The town's easy sense of safety vanished overnight. Parents forbade their daughters from walking alone. Locks that had gathered dust were suddenly used every night. Curtains were drawn, lights left on. People eyed each other with quiet suspicion, wondering who among them could have done something so monstrous. Sarah's funeral was held on December 8th at First Lutheran Church. It seemed like the entire town came. The sanctuary filled up fast, with more people crowding into the fellowship hall where speakers had been set up. Dozens stood outside in the bitter cold, heads bowed, listening through open doors. The casket was closed. The family wanted everyone to remember Sarah as she was, alive, bright, always smiling. The pastor spoke of senseless tragedy, of faith in the face of darkness, of a young life stolen far too soon. Friends shared memories between tears. Tommy Holstead, Sarah's boyfriend, tried to read something he'd written for her, but his voice broke halfway through. He never finished. Diane Renard sat in the front pew, her hand locked around her husband's, staring straight ahead. She didn't speak, didn't cry. It was as if she'd run out of tears. Under a gray December sky, Sarah was laid to rest in Manastique Cemetery. Snow flurries drifted through the air as her casket was lowered into the frozen earth. Half the town stood there that morning, united in grief. And somewhere among them, blending in with the mourners, shaking hands and offering condolences, was the person who had killed her. Now that Sarah's death was officially ruled a homicide, Detective Holloway and his team redoubled their efforts. They finally had something to work with, a cause of death, a body, and a few bits of evidence. What they didn't have was a suspect. The working theory was grim but logical. Someone had taken Sarah between the diner and her home, driven her out to the woods near Thornton Creek, killed her, and dumped her body. The location wasn't random. It was too secluded, too specific. Whoever did this knew the area well. This wasn't some drifter passing through. It was someone local, someone familiar with the back roads of Manastique. That realization made things harder, not easier. In a town of just over 3,500 people, how many men owned a vehicle and knew those woods? Hundreds. But how many were capable of something like this? That was the question that kept Holloway awake at night. Investigators went back to the start, re-interviewing everyone from the missing person phase, this time with a sharper edge. Tommy Holstead, Sarah's boyfriend, remained on their radar. Statistically, the person responsible in cases like this was often a partner or ex. Holloway brought Tommy in again. The tone was different this time, firmer, probing, relentless. Did they argue that night? Was there jealousy? Had Sarah wanted to end things? Was there someone else? Tommy swore up and down that there wasn't. He said they'd been happy, planning a future, talking about marriage someday. His parents confirmed he'd been home that evening, though Holloway knew parents sometimes lied to protect their kids. Still, Tommy agreed to take another polygraph. Once again, he passed. Investigators searched his 1976 Ford pickup top to bottom. No blood, no fibers, no sign the truck had ever been near Thornton Creek. No trace of Sarah anywhere. Reluctantly, Holloway had to move on, though he never completely cleared Tommy in his mind. Something about him, his calm, maybe his guilt, lingered. Next on the list was Raymond Ellis, the cook from Maggie's Diner. He, too, was about to find himself under the harsh glare of suspicion. Raymond Ellis, the quiet cook from Maggie's Diner, seemed like an obvious lead. He'd worked the same shift as Sarah that night and left just before her. Investigators learned he'd clocked out around 9:30 p.m., saying he went straight home. His wife backed him up, but Detective Holloway had seen that before. Wives lied for husbands more often than anyone liked to admit. They brought Raymond in for questioning. He was visibly nervous, hands shaking, eyes darting from one detective to another. But nerves weren't proof of guilt, especially when half the town was terrified of being the next suspect. When asked if they could search his car, Raymond agreed immediately. Nothing suspicious. They ran a polygraph. He passed. Investigators compared his boots to the partial print from the logging road. Wrong size, wrong tread. He was cleared. Still, the damage was done. People in Manistee whispered when he walked into the grocery store. Customers stopped talking to him at the diner. Raymond quit a month later, saying he couldn't take the stares, the silence, the feeling that everyone thought he'd done it. Next was Kevin Porter, the dishwasher. Just 19, a kid really. He'd told investigators he was with friends the night Sarah vanished. That checked out, until one of those friends mentioned that Kevin had actually shown up later than he'd claimed. Maybe around 11 instead of 10:30. That was enough for Holloway to bring him back in. Under pressure, Kevin broke. He admitted he'd lied about the timeline, but not about his alibi. He'd been smoking weed with friends that night and didn't want to get in trouble. His friends confirmed the story, the weed, and the real timeline. It didn't make him a killer. Still, investigators searched his car and his home. Nothing. Like Raymond, Kevin became collateral damage in the hunt for answers. The stares, the rumors, the whispers at the gas station. They wore him down. By summer 1980, he'd packed up and left town for good. With every local lead turning cold, investigators began to consider a darker possibility. Maybe this wasn't someone Sarah knew. Maybe her killer was a stranger, someone passing through. The theory fit the few facts they had. The tracking dogs had lost her scent abruptly, as if she'd been picked up in a vehicle. Maybe a trucker, maybe a drifter, someone who saw her walking home alone and took a chance. The Michigan State Police and Detective Holloway reached out to agencies across the Midwest. They compared notes, looking for similar cases, young women abducted, murdered, dumped in remote areas. There were a few possibilities: a waitress in Wisconsin, a college student near Marquette, a hitchhiker in Minnesota. The methods varied, none matched exactly. Then the FBI got involved. They reviewed the file and issued a behavioral profile. The offender is likely a white male, mid-20s to early 40s, familiar with the area, probably someone who blends into small communities, may have a history of violence or sexual offenses, may appear helpful, even ordinary. That description could have fit half the men in the Upper Peninsula. Holloway and his team compiled a list of every known offender within 50 miles. Sex offenders, men with assault charges, drifters, parolees. They interviewed them all. Some were cooperative, some weren't. Many had alibis. A few didn't. But not one could be linked to the crime scene by evidence. For a time, attention focused on one man, a convicted rapist from Escanaba. He'd been in Manistee the week before Sarah vanished. He had no clear alibi for the night of November 14th. His van could have made the kind of tire tracks found near Thornton Creek. Holloway brought him in for a brutal interrogation. Hours passed. The man denied everything. His polygraph was inconclusive, neither a pass nor a fail. Investigators searched his property, his van, his clothes. Nothing connected him to Sarah. Without physical proof, the case couldn't move forward. He stayed on the suspect list, but there wasn't enough to charge him. By early 1980, the FBI's stranger abduction theory was losing weight. Holloway began to suspect something worse, that this wasn't a random crime at all. Maybe Sarah knew her killer. Maybe she'd accepted a ride from someone she trusted, a regular at the diner, a neighbor, a friend of a friend, someone who seemed harmless. That possibility terrified everyone. Investigators revisited Maggie's diner, compiling a list of every man who'd sat in Sarah's section that night. They tracked each one down. Factory workers, truckers, traveling salesmen, dozens of interviews, dozens of cleared alibis. They expanded their reach to include men who lived or worked along Sarah's walking route. Maybe someone had offered her a ride out of kindness or pretended to. Again, nothing. By the spring of 1980, the momentum was gone. Holloway's team had followed every lead, interviewed hundreds, combed through every inch of evidence they had. The fibers, the boot print, the tissue under Sarah's nails. It was all there, but none of it could say anything yet. Forensic science just wasn't ready. DNA testing was still a dream. The technology they needed to solve Sarah's murder wouldn't exist for another decade. And so, as snow melted into the cold waters of Lake Michigan, the Sarah Renard case quietly slipped into the category every detective dreads most: Unsolved. By the summer of 1980, the Sarah Renard investigation had quietly faded into the background. It was never officially closed. Murder cases rarely are. But the active search for her killer had come to a stop. Detective Frank Holloway returned to Marquette, carrying the weight of a case that refused to leave him. Chief Kowalski kept the file on his desk for years, leafing through it now and then, hoping something, anything, might one day stand out. But nothing ever did. And somewhere out there, Sarah's killer walked free. The evidence sat boxed away in the Michigan State Police lab. Fibers, fingerprints, the tissue from beneath Sarah's fingernails, photos, statements, all collecting dust, waiting for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. For the Renard family, time didn't heal much of anything. Diane Renard went through the motions of living, making meals, going to church, smiling politely when she had to. But she wasn't really there anymore. Sarah's room stayed frozen in time, the bed neatly made, clothes still hanging in the closet, college brochures on the desk. Some nights, Diane would sit on the edge of that bed, holding one of Sarah's sweaters, breathing in a scent that faded a little more each year. Her husband, Robert, buried himself in work at the paper mill. Double shifts, overtime, anything to stay busy. It was easier than coming home to the silence. Within a year, he looked 10 years older. His hair went gray, his posture slumped, and that once easy smile all but vanished. Sarah's little brother, Michael, took it the hardest. He'd been 17 when she died, old enough to understand the horror, too young to know what to do with it. After graduation, he started drinking, picking fights, spiraling. In 1982, he packed up and left Monastique altogether. He couldn't stand walking the same streets where his sister had laughed, worked, and been taken from him. He tried to build a new life downstate, but the pain followed. Relationships fell apart. Jobs came and went. The weight of not knowing who killed Sarah, of never seeing justice, hung over him like a shadow that wouldn't lift. And still, through the years, the family held on to a flicker of hope. Maybe someday someone would reopen the case. Maybe someday there'd be a name. Detective Holloway never forgot her, either. Even after retiring in 1995, Sarah's face, smiling in that senior portrait, stayed with him. He'd solved hundreds of cases over his career, but this one haunted him, the one that got away. He wasn't the only one who carried that burden. Back in Monastique, David Marsh, then a rookie patrol officer, had been one of the first to arrive at the scene in 1979. He was just 24 at the time, new to the force, and the sight of what had been done to Sarah stayed with him ever since. Years later, when Marsh became chief of police in 1993, he made it a point to create a cold case review process. Every few years, he'd take out the Renard file and comb through it line by line, hoping something new might surface. Sometimes he'd even call up Holloway to talk through old theories or discuss whether new forensic techniques could help. But without fresh evidence or suspect, there wasn't much they could do. Still, they couldn't let it go. And neither could the town. Monastique moved forward, sure. Kids grew up, businesses changed hands, and the seasons came and went. But people still remembered Sarah. Her name came up quietly in diner conversations, at church gatherings, whispered between old friends who'd lived through that awful summer. And just when everyone thought the story had reached its end, 30 years later, it took a turn no one saw coming. So don't go anywhere. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will shake this quiet Michigan town to its core. Beat. If this story's pulling you in, go ahead and hit that like button. And tell me in the comments what you think happened to Sarah Renard. The search for Sarah Renard carried on into its second day, and with each passing hour, the hope that she'd simply gotten lost began to fade. Volunteers trudged through the woods in tight grid patterns, calling her name, scanning every shadow for some sign of life. They checked abandoned cabins, boarded up shacks, even old hunting blinds, anywhere someone could be hidden or hiding. Divers were brought in to comb the harbor and nearby rivers, their breath fogging in the frigid November air. It was dangerous work, thick gloves, icy water, limited visibility, but they pressed on. And yet, after hours of searching, there was nothing. No purse, no jacket, no footprints, no torn fabric or sign of a struggle. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. When the Michigan State Police arrived, they brought tracking dogs. The dogs caught Sarah's scent at Maggie's Diner, followed it down Main Street, right to the spot where George Peterson had last seen her walking. And then, nothing. The trail just stopped. That realization sent a chill through everyone involved. It wasn't a matter of a young woman getting lost or injured. This was something darker. Someone had taken Sarah. By the end of that second day, the mood around town had shifted. People were still out searching, still hopeful, but behind every determined face was fear. The kind that creeps in quietly when you start to realize the ending you were praying for might not come. Sarah's mother, Diane, stood in front of a local reporter, tears streaking her face as she begged for help. "If you know anything, if you saw anything, please help us bring our daughter home." Her voice cracked under the weight of those words. The entire community had done everything humanly possible, but Sarah was still gone, and someone, somewhere, knew why. Years passed, but the town refused to forget. Every November 14th, the people of Manistee gathered at First Lutheran Church for a small memorial service. Fewer came as time went on. Life has a way of carrying people forward, but Diane and Robert were always there, always. In 1985, the local high school dedicated a simple bench in Sarah's memory. The plaque read, "Sarah Marie Renard, 1959 to 1979, gone but never forgotten." Students would sit there between classes, some too young to remember her, but everyone knew the story. You couldn't grow up in Manistee without hearing it. The town had never been the same. Parents still warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. And though folks didn't talk about it much anymore, the unease lingered, like a ghost that refused to leave. Over time, science began to do what people couldn't: move forward. By the mid-1980s, something remarkable was happening in law enforcement. DNA profiling. What once sounded like science fiction became a revolutionary tool for justice. For the first time, investigators could take a single drop of blood, a strand of hair, a trace of skin, and identify exactly who it came from. By the 1990s, DNA testing was becoming routine. Across the country, cold cases were thawing out, some decades old, solved at last because the science had finally caught up. In 1994, the FBI launched a nationwide database called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. It allowed police to match DNA from crime scenes to known offenders all across the U.S. The results were staggering. A 1977 Florida murder was solved 10 years later when DNA tied a suspect directly to the crime. A 1981 Massachusetts case cracked wide open in 2003 when a local man who'd lived quietly in the same town for decades was finally linked to the evidence. Stories like those gave the Renards a fragile kind of hope. Maybe someday, Sarah's case could be one of them. Chief David Marsh certainly believed it could. In 1998, he reached out to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab to ask a simple question: could the evidence from 1979 be tested using modern DNA techniques? The answer? Maybe. The tissue found beneath Sarah's fingernails could hold valuable DNA, but the sample was tiny and badly degraded by time. Testing it would mean using most of what was left. A risk, but one that just might bring the truth to light. If the DNA test failed, or worse, came back inconclusive, the evidence would be gone forever. That small bit of tissue under Sarah's fingernails was all they had left, and once it was used up, there'd be no second chance. Even if testing worked and they got a DNA profile, it wouldn't mean much without a match in the system. The profile would just sit there waiting, maybe for years. So Chief Marsh made a difficult call. Wait. Technology was advancing so quickly that every year brought new breakthroughs. Better to hold off until the science and the national database were ready. It was a gamble, but a smart one. By the mid-2000s, that gamble started to pay off. DNA technology had leapt forward. Tests now required smaller samples and produced clearer, more reliable results. And the FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS, had exploded in size, containing millions of profiles from convicted offenders across the country. In 2007, with retirement on the horizon, Chief Marsh decided it was finally time. He contacted the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit and formally requested that the Sarah Renard murder investigation be reopened. The request was approved. In early 2008, nearly 3 decades after Sarah's death, the evidence was shipped to the state lab for reanalysis. Inside that box, the same samples collected in 1979. Fiber evidence, fingerprints, and most importantly, the tissue from beneath Sarah's fingernails. Forensic technicians knew the gravity of what they were handling. They worked slowly, methodically, because this wasn't just another file on the shelf. This was a young woman's final fight, preserved in microscopic traces. Weeks turned into months. Then one crisp autumn afternoon in 2008, the call came. They had a result. When the lab ran it through CODIS, the computer returned a match. After 29 years, they finally had a name. Now hold on to that thought, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Chief David Marsh's phone rang. On the other end was Detective Lieutenant Patricia Vance from the State Police Cold Case Unit. Her voice carried an unmistakable tension, the kind that makes your pulse quicken before you even know why. "David," she said, "we got a hit on the Renard case." For a moment, Marsh just sat there, frozen. He'd dreamed of hearing those words for 16 years, ever since he first pulled that dusty file from storage. And now, finally, the moment had come. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "We're sure," she said. "DNA match from CODIS. I'm sending you the report now." Marsh leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He'd promised Diane and Robert Renard that he'd never give up. And now, after all this time, science had delivered the break he'd been praying for. To understand just how incredible this was, you have to understand how far forensic science had come since 1979. Back then, all investigators could do with biological evidence was determine blood type. That might narrow down a suspect pool, but it could never identify a specific person. Millions of people shared the same type. Then came DNA profiling, the single biggest leap in criminal investigation since fingerprints. Every person's DNA is unique, like a personal code written into every cell of your body. When you touch something, you leave skin cells behind. When you bleed, your DNA stays behind with it. And if you fight for your life, as Sarah clearly had, you leave traces of your attacker beneath your fingernails. Early DNA testing in the 1980s was primitive, slow, expensive, and often unreliable. Samples had to be large and pristine. But by the 2000s, things had changed dramatically. With advanced techniques, scientists could now pull usable profiles from even tiny, decades-old fragments. That's what happened with Sarah's case. The evidence had been preserved in a climate-controlled locker for nearly 30 years, tissue scraped carefully from beneath her nails. When the lab revisited it in 2008, they used a process called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. It's a remarkable method that takes a minute amount of DNA and essentially copies it millions of times, amplifying the signal until there's enough to analyze. It's slow, delicate work, especially with degraded samples. But the technicians were skilled and determined. They targeted specific regions on the genetic code called markers, spots that vary from person to person. Modern profiling examines between 13 and 20 of these markers. The more matches between two DNA samples, the higher the certainty that they belong to the same individual. And in this case, all it took was one perfect match to shatter nearly 3 decades of silence. After weeks of slow, meticulous work, the lab finally cracked it. They managed to pull a complete DNA profile from the tissue found under Sarah Renard's fingernails. The results were clear. The DNA belonged to a man, not Sarah. This was the genetic signature of her attacker, left behind in those final desperate moments when she'd fought for her life. The next step was to run that profile through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a nationwide database filled with millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes. It's one of the most powerful tools in modern forensics. When a new profile is uploaded, CODIS automatically scans every entry for a match. The process only takes seconds, but those seconds have the power to solve crimes that have haunted families for decades. Sarah's attacker's DNA was entered into CODIS in October 2008. Moments later, the screen flashed back with a result. Match found. And not just any match, a match with a probability so precise it might as well have been destiny. The odds of it being anyone else were 1 in several trillion. This wasn't a partial hit. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a perfect match. The DNA belonged to a man named James William Turson. When Detective Patricia Vance saw the name, it didn't ring any bells. She pulled up his record. James W. Turson, age 58, born 1951. Residence, Manistee, Michigan. He'd been added to the CODIS database in 2005 after being convicted of aggravated assault. Apparently, he'd gotten into a bar fight in Escanaba that sent another man to the hospital. It was his first serious offense. He pleaded guilty, served 18 months, and was released in 2007. As part of his sentence, his DNA had been collected. Standard procedure for violent offenders in Michigan. That single routine swab had just connected him to a 30-year-old murder. When Vance cross-checked the name against the original 1979 case file, her stomach dropped. James Turson had already been interviewed during the initial investigation. He was 28 at the time, a maintenance supervisor at the paper mill, the very same mill where Sarah's father, Robert Renard, worked. He'd been questioned along with dozens of other men in town. His alibi back then? He'd claimed he was home with his wife all night. She confirmed it. With no evidence to say otherwise, he'd been cleared, and the investigation moved on. But now, 30 years later, science was rewriting that story. His DNA said otherwise. Vance knew she had to be absolutely sure. DNA evidence is powerful, but it must be handled with absolute precision. Every step of the chain of custody had to be verified. The last thing anyone wanted was to risk a contamination error that could jeopardize the case. So a second sample from the original evidence was sent to an independent lab for confirmation. 6 long weeks passed, then came the call. Same result, same match. James William Turson's DNA was found under Sarah Renard's fingernails. There was no innocent explanation for that. He'd been there. He was the one who'd strangled her. Now came the careful part, building a case solid enough to take to trial. DNA might be the smoking gun, but prosecutors always want more. Motive, opportunity, a clear timeline. They needed a complete picture before they made a move. So investigators started digging into Turson's past, both in 1979 and in the years since. Back in 1979, he'd been married, living on the east side of town. He owned a 1975 Chevy pickup, worked the evening shift at the mill, and usually clocked out around 9 p.m. That detail made everyone's pulse quicken, because it placed him on the road home right around the same time Sarah was walking home from the diner. Investigators pulled the old mill records. Sure enough, he'd worked that night. They also found his original interview from the 1979 file, noting the alibi, the wife's confirmation, everything. It was time to find her. By now, she was living in Green Bay, remarried, long divorced from Turson back in 1987. When detectives called and explained why, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said quietly, "I always wondered if he'd done it." She agreed to come in for an interview, and what she revealed would blow the case wide open, because James Turson's 1979 alibi, it had been a lie. By 2009, James William Turson wasn't just another face in Manistee, Michigan. He was a fixture, the kind of man people waved to on the street, trusted with spare keys, and called when their lawnmower wouldn't start. To most folks in town, Jim Turson was solid, reliable, a small-town success story. After his divorce back in 1987, Turson had completely reinvented himself. He left the paper mill behind and opened a little hardware shop right on Main Street, Turson's Tool Supplies. It quickly became more than just a store. It was a community hangout. Every day you'd find locals gathered by the counter, chatting about fishing spots, deer season, politics, or how bad the winter had been. Jim always had time for everyone. He remembered names, asked about the grandkids, offered advice on leaky pipes and paint brands. He was the kind of shop owner who made people feel seen, and he gave back too. He sponsored the local Little League team. Turson's Tools was printed in big white letters across the back of the kids' jerseys. After games, he'd hand out ice cream or pats on the back. He helped set up the booths for the 4th of July festival every summer. donated lumber to the high school theater department, and quietly dropped checks in the church fundraiser basket each year. In 2003, the Chamber of Commerce even named him Small Business Owner of the Year. Everyone liked Jim Turson, dependable, friendly, always willing to help. But behind that easy smile and steady handshake, he was hiding a horrifying secret, because James Turson was a murderer. A cold-blooded killer who had lived among his neighbors for 30 years, fooling them all. And the most chilling part? He'd spent decades interacting with Sarah Renard's family. Back in 1979, Jim and Sarah's father, Robert Renard, worked at the same paper mill. They weren't close friends, but they shared shifts, lunch breaks, and small talk about the Lions' lousy season. After Sarah's murder, Turson had gone out of his way to console Robert. He'd told him how sorry he was, how awful it all was, how he hoped the police would catch the monster responsible, and Robert, drowning in grief, had thanked him. Over the years, their paths kept crossing. Small-town life works that way. Robert would bump into Jim at the hardware store, or the gas station, or down at the diner. They'd exchange polite nods and brief words. Sometimes, unbelievably, Turson even showed up at Sarah's memorial services. He'd stand quietly in the back of the church, head bowed, pretending to share in the town's sorrow, while knowing full well he was the reason that family was broken. He had looked Diane Renard, Sarah's mother, straight in the eye, offered her condolences, and then gone back to his comfortable life. The sheer calculation of that deception was staggering. After killing Sarah, Turson hadn't run or panicked. He'd simply gone home, washed away the evidence, and showed up for work the next morning like nothing had happened. He'd even joined the search parties, combing through the woods with neighbors, pretending to look for the girl he'd murdered. When police interviewed him back in 1979, he was calm and cooperative. He'd given them his alibi, home with his wife, and she had backed him up. Why wouldn't she? To her, Jim was a steady husband with a steady job, not the kind of man who strangled a teenager in the woods. He slipped through the cracks completely. At that time, he was 28, married, employed, no criminal record. He didn't fit the profile of a violent predator. He wasn't a drifter or a troublemaker. He was just an ordinary man, and that's what made him so dangerous. Later, investigators would build a psychological profile, a narcissist with sociopathic traits, someone capable of imitating empathy and normal emotion without ever truly feeling it, smart enough to blend in, to mirror others, to manipulate perception. On that cold November night in 1979, he'd seen an opportunity and taken it. Sarah had been walking home alone. Turson, driving home after his shift, spotted her on the roadside. Everyone in town knew Sarah. She was the friendly waitress with the easy smile. Maybe he offered her a ride. Maybe he didn't bother asking. Either way, she ended up in his truck. What happened next was fast, brutal, and merciless. He drove her out to those dark, isolated woods. She must have realized what was happening too late. She fought him, scratched him, left her attacker's DNA beneath her fingernails. Then with his bare hands, he strangled her and left her body in the dirt. And somehow he went on living, as if none of it had ever happened. At 6:07 a.m., Chief David Marsh gave a silent nod. Detective Patricia Vance stepped forward and knocked firmly on the front door. "Mr. Turson, this is the Michigan State Police. We need to speak with you inside movement." A shadow passed across the frosted glass window. Seconds later, the door opened. Standing there in a faded bathrobe, James William Turson looked exactly as the town had always known him. Calm, composed, utterly ordinary. His graying hair was neatly combed, his eyes steady but tired, as if he'd just rolled out of bed. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. "What's this about?" Chief Marsh held his gaze. After 30 years of unanswered questions, after decades of memorial services and sleepless nights, he was finally looking into the eyes of Sarah Renard's killer. "James William Turson," Marsh said, his voice low and deliberate, "you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Marie Renard, committed on November 12, 1979. For a heartbeat, Turson didn't move. His expression didn't change. No shock, no confusion, just a slow blink, as if he were processing words that didn't belong to him. Then finally he smirked. just a flicker of something dark, before turning around and placing his hands behind his back without a word. Detective Vance read him his rights. The cuffs clicked shut. Neighbors began to peek through their curtains, drawn by the flashing red-blue lights that now pulsed against the quiet morning snow. For those watching, it didn't make sense. That was Jim Turson, the hardware guy. The man who helped fix your furnace, who lent tools, who gave candy to kids at Halloween. Not someone the police would arrest for murder. But as Turson was led to the unmarked car, the reality sank in. Manastique was about to learn that the man they'd trusted for decades had been living a lie. At the county jail, Turson was processed and booked. Mugshots were taken, the same calm expression, the same steady eyes. During his first interrogation, he denied everything. Claimed it was a mistake, a mix-up. Said he didn't even remember Sarah Renard. But the DNA didn't lie. When detectives laid the evidence on the table, the fingernail tissue, the matching DNA reports from 2 separate labs, and Linda's statement, something in his face shifted. His mouth tightened. He leaned back in the chair, stared at the ceiling, and said nothing for nearly a minute. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "Guess science finally caught up." It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Within hours, the news broke across Michigan. Arrest made in 1979, murder of Manastique teen, local business owner charged. Reporters flooded the quiet town. Satellite trucks lined Main Street. The hardware store was cordoned off as investigators searched for anything that might connect Turson to Sarah's murder. Old tools, rope, fibers, or personal items kept as trophies. Nothing obvious was found, but they didn't need it. The DNA and testimony were enough. When Robert and Diane Renard got the call, the line went silent for almost a full minute. Then Diane said quietly, "It's him. It's been him all along." She later told reporters she'd seen Turson at least a dozen times over the years, at the grocery store, at memorials, and every time she'd smiled politely. "I shook hands with the man who killed my daughter," she said, "and I didn't even know it." The arrest sent shockwaves through Manastique. People who'd once called Turson a friend now struggled to believe what he'd done. One of his employees said, "I worked for that man for 10 years. He used to talk about how evil people could be. Turns out he was talking about himself." In the weeks that followed, prosecutors built their case. The motive was never crystal clear. Maybe anger, maybe impulse, maybe something darker that had always lived inside him. But the evidence spoke louder than any motive could. In June 2010, after a 3-week trial and just 6 hours of jury deliberation, James William Turson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the verdict was read, Turson showed no emotion. He stared straight ahead, unmoved, as Diane Renard wept quietly in the front row. After 31 years, justice had finally come to Manastique. Chief Marsh retired the following year. In his office, he kept one photo on his wall, a black and white picture of Sarah Renard smiling in her diner uniform. Beneath it, a note in his handwriting read, "Chief Marsh rapped on the door." 3 sharp, deliberate knocks that cut through the quiet morning air. "Police! Open up!" he called out. Inside movement, slow, cautious footsteps, then silence. Whoever was in there, probably Jim Turson, was watching through the peephole, trying to figure out why officers were standing on his porch at dawn. After a few tense seconds, the door swung open. There stood James William Turson, jeans and flannel shirt on, a steaming coffee mug in hand. His graying hair was tousled, reading glasses perched on his head. He looked every bit the harmless, small-town retiree, someone who might offer to snowblow your driveway or lend you a wrench. "Jim?" he said with a faint, puzzled smile, recognizing Chief Marsh. "What's going on?" Marsh's voice was steady, practiced, decades of experience wrapped in authority. "James William Turson, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Marie Renard." For the briefest flicker of a second, something shifted in Turson's face. Not confusion, not fear, recognition. He knew exactly why they were there. Then the mask snapped back into place. "What? There must be some mistake. Turn around and put your hands behind your back," interrupted Detective Vance, already stepping forward with the cuffs. Turson's jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the street, calculating, assessing, but it was useless. He was surrounded, outnumbered. He set the mug down carefully on the porch rail and complied. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the cold morning air. "You have the right to remain silent," Marsh began, reciting the Miranda warning as Vance tightened the cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Turson said nothing. His expression went blank, drained of all warmth. The friendly hardware man was gone, replaced by a hollow stare, cold, predatory, empty. Inside, officers performed a quick sweep of the house. It was neat, spotless, and painfully ordinary. No signs of struggle, no trophies, just the quiet order of a man who'd built his life around control. When they led him outside, dawn had fully broken. Across the street, Margaret Kowalski, a retired teacher, stood frozen on her porch, bathrobe clutched around her, eyes wide with disbelief. 2 houses down, Bill Henderson was starting his truck when he saw the scene unfold. He froze mid-step. "Jim?" he called out. "What the hell's going on?" No one answered. The cruisers rolled away in silence, leaving a neighborhood of stunned onlookers behind. Within minutes, phones were ringing up and down Birch Street. Margaret called her sister. Bill called his wife. The local rumor mill kicked into overdrive. By 7:30 a.m., half of Manistee knew Jim Turson had been arrested. By 8 a.m., they knew why. The whispers turned into gasps. "Did you hear? They arrested Jim." "For what?" "For Sarah Renard." "Wait, Sarah Renard?" That was 30 years ago. They said DNA. They matched his DNA. My God, he's been living here all this time. At Turson's Tool Supplies, the front door was locked. A hastily scribbled sign taped to the glass. "Closed until further notice." Locals gathered outside, peering through the windows as if the store itself might reveal something. Some clue about how the man they'd trusted for decades could have done something so monstrous. By mid-morning, the media had descended on Manistee. News vans lined Main Street, camera crews unpacking tripods and lights. Reporters from Marquette, Green Bay, even Detroit stood in front of the hardware store, their voices crisp with urgency. Behind me is the business owned by James W. Turson, the man arrested this morning for the 1979 murder of local teenager Sarah Renard. The shocking arrest has shaken this quiet Upper Peninsula town to its core. For a place where the biggest news was usually the county fair or a fishing derby, and this was something else entirely. Neighbors gawked from porches as cameras panned the quiet streets. Some agreed to interviews, still dazed by the morning's events. Others slammed their doors, unwilling to speak. At noon, Chief Marsh faced the cameras. Standing behind a wooden podium at the small-town municipal building, he confirmed the arrest and the DNA evidence, but offered no further details. His tone was careful, respectful. Decades of frustration and heartache were finally giving way to justice. But Marsh knew one thing. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning. Before the arrest was made public, the Renard family received the call. Diane and Robert, now in their 70s, sat together in their living room, the same place they'd waited decades ago, praying for their daughter to walk back through the front door. Only this time, there were answers. After 30 long, aching years, they finally knew who had taken Sarah from them. But the news that brought them some measure of peace brought Manistee nothing but chaos. For 3 decades, the town had lived under the shadow of Sarah's unsolved murder. It had faded into the background over time, an open wound people learned to live around. Most had come to believe the killer was some drifter who passed through and vanished into the night. Finding out he'd been right there all along, living among them, shaking their hands, fixing their tools, sponsoring their kids' baseball teams, was almost too much to process. It shattered something deep and sacred: trust. The shock rolled through town like a cold wind. Suddenly, people began replaying every past interaction with Jim Turson, each one taking on a dark, unsettling tint. That friendly chat at the hardware store, was he laughing at them the whole time? That generous church donation? Was it guilt? That warm smile at the Little League field? What was he really thinking? Parents whose kids wore jerseys with Turson's Tools printed on the back felt sick to their stomachs. He'd been around their children, handed them popsicles after games, patted them on the shoulder. The thought turned their blood cold. What if he could have hurt one of them? People whispered. What if we'd all been in danger and never knew it? Carol Jensen, whose son had played under Turson's sponsorship for 5 years, told a local reporter, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about all the times my boy was near that man. I thanked him. I smiled at him. Now, I just feel sick. The emotional toll spread fast. At the high school, guidance counselors were called in. Many students had known Turson their entire lives. He wasn't just the hardware guy. He was a familiar face, someone who fixed their bikes or showed up to community fundraisers. Learning that he was capable of murder flipped their understanding of safety upside down. If someone like Jim could hide something like this for 30 years, one teacher said quietly, then how do we ever really know anyone? The town began to split into two camps. Some simply refused to believe it. Despite the DNA evidence, despite the arrest, they insisted there had to be a mistake. Jim wouldn't hurt a fly, said Harold Brennan, a longtime customer. I've known that man for 20 years. This just doesn't add up. Others weren't surprised. They pointed to his 2005 assault conviction, the one most people had shrugged off back then as a bad moment or a one-time lapse. Now it looked like the red flag everyone had ignored. I always thought there was something off about him, became a common refrain, though when pressed, few could say exactly what that something was. The truth was, Turson had blended in too well. He'd been careful, friendly, helpful, ordinary, exactly the kind of man no one would ever suspect. Still, as the shock settled, memories began to resurface. Little things that hadn't seemed important before now felt deeply unsettling. Linda Marsh, no relation to Chief Marsh, remembered how Turson always seemed fascinated by true crime stories. He'd bring them up at the hardware store, she recalled. He'd talk about unsolved murders, speculate on motives. I thought he was just into crime shows like the rest of us. Now I wonder if he was reliving it. Others shared similar chills, small details, strange moments, comments that, in hindsight, carried a darker meaning. The realization hit everyone differently, but one feeling united the town: disbelief mixed with betrayal. The man they trusted most had been the monster hiding in plain sight. What had he really been thinking all those years? Parents couldn't shake that question. Those whose kids had worn Little League jerseys with Turson's tools printed proudly on the back were sick to their stomachs. He'd been around their children, handing out ice cream, clapping for them after games, patting their shoulders with that same hand that had once taken a life. What if he'd hurt one of them? People whispered. What if we'd been in danger and never even knew it? Carol Jensen, whose son had played under Turson's sponsorship for 5 years, told a local reporter through tears, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about all the times my boy was near that man, all the times I thanked him. I feel sick to my stomach. The psychological shock rippled through the entire community. At the high school, guidance counselors were brought in to help students process the news. Many of those kids had grown up knowing Turson as a friendly face, a safe adult, someone who helped fix bikes or sponsored fundraisers. Finding out he was a murderer shattered their sense of what and who was safe. If someone like Jim Turson could fool everyone for 30 years, one student asked, who else might be hiding something? The town of Manistee split right down the middle. Some people flat out refused to believe it. Despite the DNA match, despite the arrest, they insisted it had to be a mistake. Jim wouldn't hurt a fly, said Harold Brennan, a regular at the hardware store. I've known that man for 20 years. This just doesn't make sense. Others weren't shocked at all. They pointed to his 2005 assault conviction as proof that something had always been off about him, though back then, most had dismissed it as a one-time lapse in judgment. I always thought there was something off about him, became the new small-town chorus, even though few could say what that something was. The truth was, Turson had been too good at blending in. He was polite, reliable, generous. Just good old Jim. No one ever saw the monster behind the mask. As the disbelief turned to reflection, residents started sifting through old memories, looking for warning signs they might have missed. Linda Marsh, no relation to the police chief, Remembered how Turson used to bring up true crime stories at the store. He'd talk about unsolved murders, speculate about what kind of person could do something like that, she said. I thought he was just interested in crime stories. Now I wonder if he was reliving his own others recalled moments that seemed harmless at the time, but now felt bone-chilling. The way he never seemed emotional about Sarah's murder, the way he'd make dark jokes about how the killer probably skipped town, or how he eventually stopped going to memorial services, as if the whole thing had bored him. For Sarah's family, the arrest was an emotional storm. Relief, fury, heartbreak, all tangled together. Diane Renard, now 73, had spent half her life wondering who took her daughter. She'd imagined countless faces, countless scenarios. But Jim Turson? Never once. When Chief Marsh told her, she'd gone silent for what felt like an eternity. Then she asked quietly, "Did Robert know him?" "Yes, ma'am," Marsh said. "They worked together at the mill." Diane's eyes closed. "He was at the funeral," she whispered. That truth, knowing that her daughter's killer had stood beside her family, shaking hands, offering condolences, was almost too much to bear. Robert Renard's reaction was different. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. His face hardened like stone. "I want to testify," he said simply. "When this goes to trial, I want to look him in the eye." Michael Renard, Sarah's younger brother, got the call in Grand Rapids. He was 46 now, with a wife and 2 kids of his own. For years, he'd tried to move on, to keep the ghosts of that night buried. But the news dragged them all back. He took a week off work and drove north to Monaste, the first time he'd returned in over a decade. Seeing the news vans, the flashing cameras, and the "closed until further notice" sign taped to the front of Turson's tool supplies, he felt an old fury rise up in his chest. "He was here the whole time," Michael told a reporter outside the locked storefront. His voice shook, not from fear but rage. Living his life, building his business, like nothing ever happened. "While my sister was in the ground and my parents were destroyed, he stole everything from us." Those were Michael Renard's words to a reporter outside the courthouse. And for the people of Monaste, it summed up how everyone felt. But what came next made things even harder. The media circus rolled in and didn't leave for weeks. Satellite trucks lined Main Street, reporters camped outside the sheriff's office and the courthouse, and every cable network wanted a piece of the story. Monaste wasn't used to that kind of attention. Suddenly, the quiet little town was a national headline. Journalists knocked on doors, stopped people in parking lots, even cornered shoppers at the grocery store. "Do you remember Jim Turson? Did you ever suspect? What was he really like?" It was relentless. Some residents shut down completely, pulling their blinds, putting up no trespassing signs, refusing to answer questions. Others, maybe craving understanding or just overwhelmed by the shock, spoke to the cameras. Their faces, tired, emotional, confused, filled the evening news. And just like that, Monaste's identity changed forever. It wasn't just another small Upper Peninsula town anymore. It was the town where a killer hid for 30 years. Church attendance soared. People needed comfort, something to hold on to. At First Lutheran, Pastor Williams began hosting special evening services. He spoke softly from the pulpit, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "We're all struggling to understand how this happened," he told his congregation, "how evil can hide behind a friendly face. But remember, this is one man's sin, not ours. We were deceived. That doesn't make us complicit." Wise words, but for many they didn't erase the guilt. People kept replaying moments in their minds. The times they'd shaken Turson's hand, laughed at his jokes, let their kids sit on his lap at the 4th of July parade. They'd liked him, trusted him, done business with him, and all along he'd been a murderer hiding behind a smile. Meanwhile, the case against James William Turson was taking shape, built on science, testimony, and the slow unraveling of 3 decades of deceit. The DNA was the foundation, solid and undeniable. Back in 1979, investigators had collected tissue from beneath Sarah Renard's fingernails, evidence that had sat frozen for years. When modern technology finally tested it, the results were explosive. The male DNA profile was compared against Turson's, collected in 2005 after his assault conviction. 13 genetic markers were tested, All 13 matched. The odds of that happening by chance? 1 in 4. 7 trillion. For perspective, there are only about 8 billion people on Earth. In other words, it wasn't someone like Turson, it was him. Sarah had fought back fiercely that night, leaving behind the evidence that would, decades later, expose her killer. But prosecutors weren't relying on DNA alone. When Turson's name surfaced, detectives went back through the original case files, and suddenly things that hadn't made sense before clicked into place. Those tire tracks found on the remote logging road in 1979, photographed and cast in plaster, were compared to records of Turson's 1975 Chevy pickup. He'd sold the truck in 1981, but investigators tracked down the current owner in Wisconsin. The tires were long replaced, but the wheelbase and weight distribution matched the tracks from the scene perfectly. Not enough for conviction, but enough to tighten the noose. Then came the fibers. Dark blue cotton threads found on Sarah's clothing. When reanalyzed with modern forensic methods, they were consistent with the type of uniform shirts worn by paper mill workers in the late 70s. Exactly what Turson had worn to work. Each piece on its own wasn't damning, but together they painted a clear picture. And then came the testimony that prosecutors called the human key. Linda Turson, Jim's ex-wife, the woman who had unknowingly helped him build his alibi, was ready to tell the truth. She told investigators that Jim hadn't been home the night Sarah disappeared, that he'd come home late, taken a shower, and that his work clothes had mysteriously vanished. She'd lied back then because she was scared and confused, but not this time. Her testimony would shatter the false alibi that had kept Turson off the suspect list for decades. And finally, prosecutors planned to present evidence of his 2005 assault conviction, a brutal bar fight that left another man hospitalized. Normally, past crimes aren't admissible in court, but in this case, the sheer violence of that attack showed a pattern, a glimpse of the rage that had driven him to kill. Piece by piece, the story was coming together. After 30 long years, the mask of Jim Turson, the friendly hardware store owner, the Little League sponsor, the pillar of the community, was crumbling. And underneath, the truth was uglier than anyone had ever imagined. When James William Turson stood before the court on March 15, 2009, he looked like any other aging man. Gray hair, heavy shoulders, thick glasses. But to the people of Manaste, he wasn't just another old man. He was the monster who'd lived among them. He entered a plea of not guilty. The words echoed in the courtroom like a bad joke. His defense attorney, Richard Polson, a respected lawyer from Marquette, knew from the beginning he was fighting uphill. The DNA evidence was nearly bulletproof. You can argue emotion, motive, even memory, but you can't argue with genetics. Still, Polson tried. His defense strategy rested on 3 fragile pillars. Small cracks he hoped would grow into reasonable doubt. First, he attacked the chain of custody. The tissue samples from beneath Sarah Renard's fingernails had been collected 3 decades earlier. 30 years of storage, handling, transfers. Could contamination have occurred? Could samples have been mislabeled or degraded? The prosecution was ready for this. They laid out a paper trail so meticulous it bordered on obsessive. Every officer, every technician, every transfer of evidence had been logged, signed, and verified. Independent forensic labs had retested the samples and confirmed the match. There were no breaks, no mishandled steps. The chain of custody was airtight. Polson shifted to a second angle, context and interpretation. He suggested that even if the DNA was legitimate, it didn't prove murder. Maybe Turson had contact with Sarah earlier that day. Maybe the DNA got there innocently. But the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Karen Wilcox, dismantled that theory within minutes. The DNA wasn't found on her jacket or her hands, she told the jury. It was found beneath her fingernails. You don't get there from a handshake. Then came the third angle, the possibility of a setup. Polson floated the idea, quietly but deliberately, that someone could have planted or swapped the evidence over the decades. But even that suggestion fell apart under the weight of hard facts. The evidence had been sealed in secure, temperature-controlled storage since 1979, its integrity verified repeatedly over the years. By the end of the first week, it was clear the defense was drowning. The prosecution's case, however, only grew stronger. The DNA was the cornerstone. Irrefutable. scientific, and cold. The odds of coincidence? 1 in 4.7 trillion. That's not doubt. That's destiny catching up. Sarah Renard had fought back that night in 1979. She'd clawed her attacker, leaving behind a microscopic trace of the truth, a truth that technology had finally unlocked 30 years later. And with that single drop of blood, every lie Turson had told began to unravel. Investigators walked the jury back through the rest of the evidence, piece by piece, showing how each puzzle fragment now fit perfectly into place. The tire tracks on the old logging road, preserved in plaster, matched the wheelbase of Turson's 1975 Chevy pickup, the one he'd quietly sold 2 years after the murder. The blue cotton fibers found on Sarah's clothing matched the work shirts worn at the paper mill where Turson was employed. The false alibi, provided decades earlier by his then-wife Linda Turson, now crumbled as she took the stand and told the truth. "He wasn't home that night," she testified softly, eyes downcast. "He came back late. His clothes were gone the next morning. When the police asked questions, he told me exactly what to say. And I said it. I was scared. I didn't know what he'd done. Now I do." Her voice cracked, and the courtroom fell silent. That moment, the trembling confession of a woman haunted by guilt, struck harder than any lab report ever could. And finally, the prosecution moved to establish pattern and behavior. They introduced evidence of Turson's 2005 assault conviction, arguing that his violent tendencies weren't new or isolated. It wasn't about painting him as evil. It was about showing who he truly was all along. When the prosecution rested, there was a sense in the courtroom that something larger than a verdict was approaching. It wasn't just about proving Turson's guilt anymore. It was about giving Sarah Renard her voice back after 30 long, silent years. Independent labs had verified every test result, leaving no room for argument. The chain of custody was rock solid. Still, Richard Polson wasn't giving up. His next move was to challenge the meaning of the DNA evidence itself. Yes, the DNA matched, he said. But what did that really prove? Contact, sure, but not murder. Maybe James Turson had met Sarah that day. Maybe he'd given her a ride or helped her carry something. There were plenty of ways his DNA could have transferred innocently. It was a clever angle, but it didn't hold. The prosecution countered swiftly and decisively. The DNA wasn't on her jacket or her hand, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Kowalski told the jury. It was found beneath her fingernails, embedded in tissue she tore from her attacker while fighting for her life. That's not casual contact, that's violence. The room went still. You could have heard a pin drop. Next, Polson went after Linda Turson, the ex-wife whose testimony had shattered her husband's old alibi. He painted her as bitter, resentful, and out for revenge. "She's angry," he told the jury. "She wants to hurt him the only way she can now, by helping the state." But the problem was, Linda's story didn't wobble. Every detail she gave was consistent with the records and the timeline. She wasn't trying to benefit. If anything, she was risking her own legal trouble by admitting she'd lied to police 30 years ago. "He told me what to say," she said quietly on the stand. "And I said it. I was scared back then. I'm not anymore." It was raw and real, and it landed hard. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the man at the center of it all still clung to his lies. "I didn't kill Sarah Renard," Turson told reporters after one hearing. "I don't know how my DNA got there, but I didn't do this." It was the kind of statement that sounds firm on the surface but says almost nothing at all. Carefully worded denial, just enough to maintain the illusion of innocence, without committing to any details that could be disproven. But behind the scenes, according to people close to the case, the calm facade cracked. In private, Turson was angry, bitter that he'd been caught after so long. Not guilty, just caught. There was no remorse, no confession, only rage that his carefully built life, the business, the community trust, the friendly smile, was collapsing around him. When prosecutors offered him a plea deal, second-degree murder, life in prison with a chance at parole after 30 years, he refused without hesitation. Maybe he thought he could still win. Or maybe after 30 years of lies, admitting the truth was simply impossible. Either way, it meant the trial was on. Set for September 2009, it was shaping up to be the most significant trial in the history of Manistee. The entire Upper Peninsula seemed to hold its breath. Assistant DA Jennifer Kowalski, no relation to Chief Kowalski, told her team, "This is one of the strongest cases I've ever prosecuted. The evidence speaks for itself. James Turson murdered Sarah Renard, and we're going to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt." When the trial opened on September 14, 2009, the Schoolcraft County Courthouse was overflowing. Every seat was filled. Reporters, sketch artists, townspeople who'd come to witness history. In the front row sat Diane and Robert Renard, Sarah's parents, now in their 70s, frail but unflinching, with their son Michael and other family members beside them. Across the aisle sat James Turson, in a suit and tie beside his lawyer. Gone was the friendly hardware store owner. What sat there now was colder, watchful, hard-eyed. Presiding over it all was Judge Margaret Hendricks, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench. She made it clear from day one, this courtroom will show respect for the victim, for the families, and for the process. Even jury selection had been an ordeal. In a small community where everyone knew someone touched by the case, finding 12 impartial jurors was nearly impossible. But somehow they did. 7 women, 5 men, ranging from 26 to 68 years old. When Kowalski rose to deliver the opening statement for the prosecution, she took a breath and began to walk the jury through time, back to November 14, 1979. She spoke of Sarah, walking home from work that cold night, of the search that followed, of the discovery no parent should ever have to endure, of 30 years of unanswered questions, and how science had finally found the answer. The defendant's DNA was found beneath Sarah Renard's fingernails, Kowalski said, her voice steady. She scratched him while fighting for her life. She marked her killer, and 30 years later that evidence is speaking for her. It was powerful, simple, and devastating. Then Polson stood for the defense. His opening words aimed not to inspire belief, just doubt. He nodded toward the DNA but suggested alternative explanations. There are gaps, he told the jury. There are questions that science alone cannot answer. And where there is uncertainty, there must be reasonable doubt. But as the first witnesses prepared to take the stand, it already felt like the truth had momentum on its side: contamination, mishandling, innocent contact. Those were the pillars of the defense's argument, and every single one of them wobbled under pressure. Attorney Richard Polson did his best to paint Linda Turson as an unreliable witness, a bitter ex-wife with a grudge. But everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The defense was grasping at straws, and the truth was closing in. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution's case unfolded like a masterclass in patience and precision. Forensic experts took the stand first. They spoke calmly and clearly, breaking down decades of science for the jury. How the DNA had been extracted from the tissue under Sarah Renard's fingernails, how it had been matched to James Turson, and why the results were absolutely conclusive. Charts, diagrams, even probability models, all of it laid out with quiet confidence. The defense tried to poke holes, question the process, challenge the technology, but the science held firm. Every explanation was airtight. Then came day 4, and with it, Linda Turson. She walked to the witness stand looking small and fragile, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Her voice wavered at first, but her words carried the weight of 30 years. "He came home late that night," she said. "His clothes were gone. He told me to say he'd been home, that we'd had dinner together. I wanted to believe him. I didn't want to think my husband could do something like that. But deep down, I knew." Her voice broke then, but she pressed on. Polson's cross-examination was sharp, even cruel at times. He accused her of lying out of spite, of trying to punish her ex-husband after all these years. But Linda didn't flinch. "I lied once," she said, "and I've lived with that shame for 30 years. I won't lie again." The jury was transfixed. You could see it on their faces, a mix of empathy, anger, and disbelief. Several jurors wiped their eyes as she stepped down. Later, Robert Renard, Sarah's father, took the stand. He spoke about working alongside Turson at the mill, about shaking his hand after the funeral, about the horror of realizing the man offering condolences had been his daughter's killer all along. His voice was calm, but every word carried years of buried pain. The defense's rebuttal was brief. Two character witnesses, neighbors who described Turson as generous and kind. But against the mountain of evidence and testimony, it sounded hollow, almost desperate. Turson himself did not testify. Polson knew better. The prosecution would have torn him apart. By the time closing arguments came on September 28th, everyone in that courtroom knew which way the wind was blowing. Prosecutor Jennifer Kowalski stood before the jury one final time. Her tone was measured but firm. She recapped every fact, every test result, every witness, building the case like a wall no one could climb. James Turson murdered Sarah Renard, she said in closing. The evidence proves it. Science proves it. And now it's time for Justice Polson followed, his closing argument a last flicker of resistance. Talk of reasonable doubt, of uncertainties. But even he seemed defeated. His words trailed off without conviction. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the room fell silent. Judge Margaret Hendricks asked, "On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The forewoman, Patricia Mills, a retired teacher, stood. "We find the defendant guilty." Gasps, sobs. A few muffled cheers quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Diane Renard collapsed into her husband's arms, trembling. Michael closed his eyes, exhaling 30 years of pain and grief. And James Turson, the man who'd hidden in plain sight for 3 decades, didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes empty. 2 weeks later came the sentencing. Before the judge pronounced it, the family was allowed to speak. Michael went first. "You took my sister. You took my parents' daughter. You stole our future, our peace, our sense of safety. And then you lived among us, pretending to be one of us. You're a coward and a monster," Robert followed, his words simple but searing. "I hope you suffer every day for the rest of your life, the way we have for 30 years. Diane couldn't speak. She simply held up a photo of Sarah, smiling and full of life, the daughter she'd never stopped missing. Judge Hendricks looked directly at Turson. "You committed a heinous crime," she said, her voice heavy with disgust. "Then you spent 3 decades deceiving this community. You've shown no remorse, no humanity. The law gives me no discretion here." As the deputies led him away in handcuffs, for the first time Turson's mask cracked. His face twisted with rage. Not sorrow, not guilt, just fury at losing control. Outside the courthouse, under gray skies and flashing cameras, the Renard family stood together. "It doesn't bring Sarah back," Diane said quietly, "but at least now we know. At least now, there's justice. Justice, when it finally comes after 30 years, can't erase the pain, but it can give something back. The smallest piece of peace. And for Diane and Robert Renard, still living in that same little house in Manistee, that was finally enough." As the years passed, the Renards carried on, their bodies weary, but their hearts lighter. By the time James Turson was finally convicted, Diane and Robert were both in their mid-70s, aged by decades of grief, but freed at last from the crushing weight of uncertainty. "We can finally breathe," Diane told a reporter a year after the verdict. "For 30 years, we lived not knowing. Now we know, and he can't hurt anyone else." Robert passed away in 2012 at 78. His obituary mentioned that he died having seen justice served for his daughter, a small mercy after a lifetime of sorrow. Diane, now in her late 80s, still lives in Manistee. Every week she visits Sarah's grave, bringing fresh flowers, speaking softly as if her daughter can still hear her. In a way, maybe she can. Sarah's brother Michael returned to Grand Rapids after the trial. For years, anger had defined him, but something shifted once justice came. He became an advocate for cold case investigations, traveling to police conferences to tell his family's story. "My family waited 30 years, he'd say, "but we got answers. There are thousands of families still waiting. Don't let them wait forever." Manistee's healing took longer. Learning that their friendly hardware store owner, a man they'd trusted for 3 decades, was a murderer left deep scars. Some residents moved away, unable to reconcile memories with reality. Others stayed, but with a quieter, sobered sense of awareness. That evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and lives right next door. Turson's hardware store sat empty for months. Eventually, it was sold and transformed into an antique shop. The new owners stripped away every trace of its past. Even the Little League team he'd sponsored got new uniforms, fresh colors, a clean slate. Still, the town found a kind of strength in the aftermath. Annual memorials for Sarah continued, but now they felt different. Not just mournful, but grateful. Justice had arrived, even if late. Sarah's story became a rallying point for investigators nationwide. Across the U.S., thousands of cold cases remain unsolved, evidence boxes collecting dust. Her case proved that time doesn't always win, that technology, perseverance, and faith can reach back across decades and speak for the voiceless. In 1979, the idea of identifying a killer from a trace of skin under a fingernail sounded like science fiction. Today, it's standard procedure. DNA analysis has solved thousands of long-forgotten crimes, unmasking offenders who once believed they'd gotten away with murder. The message is clear. There is no expiration date on justice. Chief David Marsh, who helped close Sarah's case, retired in 2011. In his farewell speech, he said, "We owed it to her. We owed it to her family. We owed it to this community to show that we don't forget and we don't give up." Stories like this matter. They remind us that even delayed justice still holds power. They give hope to families still waiting for answers. They prove that evil, no matter how carefully hidden, can be revealed, and that remembering the victims keeps them alive in spirit. Sarah Renard was only 20. She wanted to be a nurse. She wanted to help people, to build a life filled with purpose. James Turson stole that from her. But he couldn't erase her memory, the love she left behind, or the strength she showed in her final moments. The evidence she left that ultimately exposed him. In the end, Sarah had the last word. She was more than a case file, more than a statistic. She was a daughter who made her mother laugh, a sister who stood up for her little brother, a friend who remembered your coffee order, a young woman chasing her dreams. For 30 years, her name was tied to a mystery. Now it's tied to a legacy of justice and perseverance. Her story reminds us to never stop believing that truth can surface, no matter how deep it's buried. And yes, it's also a quiet warning. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear friendly faces. But don't let that make you fearful. Let it make you vigilant. Trust your instincts, watch out for one another, and never stop asking questions when something feels wrong. For every family still waiting for justice, don't lose hope. The science keeps improving. Investigators keep reopening those dusty boxes. Your loved one's case could be next. If Sarah's story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases. It helps us keep these stories alive and bring light to others still waiting in the dark. And I'd love to hear from you. Should there ever be a time limit on cold case investigations? Or should justice always be pursued, no matter how many years have passed? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching, for remembering Sarah, and for believing that truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home.